So welcome everyone officially to our September monthly webinar. And today we are super excited to have Dr. Zayas presenting on developmental and mental health impact of immigration and detention on children. We are going to start off with some announcements as we usually do. We've been having ongoing discussions internally and externally at El Futuro and with Mesita around the terms that we use for our programming. We've kind of found out that there's no consensus on this. It's more about kind of stating your decision and explaining why, and so that's what we're doing here. So we, for Mesita, we use Latinx because we feel this is a term that brings to our audience's attention the gender binary included in the language, Spanish language, and so Latinx brings attention to the broader spectrum of gender identities. However, we don't use that at El Futuro with our clients, as we find that this is a term that has come from the ivory tower down to the community and is not necessarily used or well received within the community. So in our care, we use Latino, Latina. We also, we don't impose this on anyone else. It's just a decision that we're making as an organization. So just wanted to mention that. Also want to mention that our learning cohort, the applications for the next one are open. This will be running from January to May. And so this is a course that we have developed at El Futuro on its basic but evidence-based best practices for working with Latinx folks in service provision. It's a 5-month-long course where we get to connect with other providers around the state, engage in learning activities together. And it's really just been a real joy for us to host these courses twice a year. So if you would like to find out more about that, you can either go through the website, go through the network, or if you go to our website, you go under training and education, you can go to learning cohort, it will take you to this page, you hit the apply here button, and it'll take you to the application. And Katie, I think you're unmuted. I'm just gonna mute you real quick. So we will have opportunities for folks to speak up during our presentation today. Our webinars are always, we strive to make them as interactive as possible. Dr. Zayas has given me permission to give you all permission to type in questions as we're going along with the presentation. You have any things you want to clarify. We may not address it right at that moment, but I will be saving them and referring back to the chat once we get to the Q&A sections. And there'll be, in particular, specific sections for that after some videos that Dr. Zayas will present for audience participation. So we hope you all join us in that conversation. Big thank you to Greensboro AHEC, who helped to provide our continuing education credits. So just a reminder, if you want your continuing education credits for today, please fill out your evaluation within 1 week after today's webinar. So as I mentioned, Dr. Zayas will be presenting on developmental and mental health impact of immigration and detention on children. So I want to introduce Dr. Zayas, and it's kind of a surreal and honor to have him here with us. I first found out about Dr. Zayas' work in my graduate training not that long ago. I only finished about 2-3 years ago, but most of the research that I read and included in my work was his research into the cultural and particular vulnerabilities of Latina for increased suicidality. And more recently, his work has focused on what you'll be seeing today on the impacts of detention, deportation, family separations for the Latinx community. So super excited to share his expertise with you all today. So a little bit about Dr. Zayas. He's the Dean and the Robert Lee Sutherland Chair in Mental Health and Social Policy at the Steve Bix School of Social Work. And he's a professor of psychiatry at the Dell Medical School at the University of Texas at Austin. He's also a social worker and a developmental psychologist by training. And his clinical work and research have focused on disadvantaged families, particularly Hispanic and other ethnic racial minorities. So Dr. Zayas, we're so honored to have you here. I will stop sharing now. Actually, I won't. We're doing polls first. So before I turn it over to Dr. Zayas, you will now see a poll come up for you, asking you two things. First, to let us know where you're located in North Carolina. You can also type in the chat if you're not in North Carolina. And then if you scroll down, there's a second question that asks you to designate what your discipline is. So please go ahead and fill that out, and then we will reveal the results at the end, or at the end shortly. Just give it a couple more seconds. Okay, I think we can go ahead and publish. So can you all see that? Can you see that, Dr. Zayas, on your screen? And you can scroll down and see. So we've got largely Triangle, which is where we're located in the Durham area in Raleigh. But we've got a nice spread minus the east of North Carolina. And we have a large proportion of our audience today is social workers, counselors. We have some MDs, some school-based providers. We have a couple of students and then other, which we'd love to hear about in the chat about what your other disciplines are. So now, indeed, I will stop sharing, and Dr. Zayas, you can take it away. And Dr. Zayas, you're muted.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, go ahead. And
okay,
just want to make sure you click that share sound button when you share.
I sure.
Okay.
I'm trying to get to where I can the slideshow function here is difficult to find when there's this thing at the top here, this banner.
Yeah, the Zoom banner.
Is one of these at the bottom a way of sharing it?
Yeah, that one right there that you're on.
Ah, perfect. I've learned something new. Thank you very much. It's an interesting technology that we have. And I discovered last night that some of my files had been hacked. And so the IT people are saying, so what files do you have and what drivers and whatnot? I didn't know their language. So I can barely do this, never mind tell them where those files were located on this enormous university. But anyways, I'm happy to be here. And I didn't mark that I'm from outside North Carolina on your survey, but that would have been what you would have seen, the 1% or so that's from outside. And I want to thank Dr. Prandoni for the invitation to be here. I feel honored that among the past speakers are some very distinguished people who I look up to. And so it's quite an honor to be speaking with you today. And I will tell you a little bit more about what I want to talk about. I just want to add one thing that I hope, that Dr. Prandoni, in addition to recording this presentation can be made available permanently on your webpage and shared with your constituents wherever they are.
We appreciate that.
What I will be speaking about comes from some of the research I'm doing right now that's funded by the NIH, but I have no other financial disclosures. And I would hope that I wouldn't have to do this for this audience, but it's going to involve some rather graphic pictures and videos, and so be prepared. I always say I shouldn't have to say that because I tell my students, if you came into social work or psychology, you're not going to get trigger warnings all the time when when your clients encounter or bring you with all sorts of problems in their lives that might be disturbing, but we don't know what we're going to encounter when we leave home that morning. And so that's why I hesitate and say trigger warnings, but for those of you who abide by them, I want to be respectful of you. So I want to approach this conversation from both the clinical and theoretical perspectives of attachment and bonding and the impact that detention has on families and children and parent-child relationships, but also to talk about stress and trauma. And so that will be my perspective, but I want to make it as clinical as possible. I don't want to get too lofty on theory, but just enough so that we are acquainted and on the same page, as they say. So I don't know why I'm getting up there. We all know something about attachment. I hope, it is, after all, the fundamental human bond between parent and child. And we also know that the quality of that attachment affects our lives lifelong, both with respect to mental health and the relationships we form, whether we call them interpersonal relationships or object relationships. That early attachment really does make a difference. And what we do know too is that through research, that the securely attached child is the modal child across cultures. This is a confident, child, positive interaction with parents, especially upon reunion after a separation. And that kind of secure attachment, again, has a positive impact on the emotional, behavioral, cognitive, and social development of a child, including linguistic, by the way, though I didn't list it there. And a long time ago, back in the early or late 80s and early 90s, I was involved in some research on culture and attachment. And it was an interesting situation because most of the research at that time had been done on middle-class white families and children, and to some extent, Black families in the Baltimore area, because a lot of this work was being done at Maryland and Johns Hopkins and that area. And that's where we learned, by research done in Europe and some parts here in the US, including New York, where I was, that secure attachment, again, is the modal child universally, whether you're talking about, Northern Europe or South America or the US and so on. But the child rearing styles and the maternal behaviors would differ. We found in one of our projects that what we called routine holdings by moms, where they might place the child on their hip as they're going about doing their chores, in some cultures results in an insecure attachment. In the Latino populations that we were studying, in that case, it was mostly Puerto Ricans and Dominicans in New York City, that same routine holding was associated with positive or secure attachment. So we saw two different cultures here, and the same maternal behavior, but different outcomes. The same thing we found with preemptive interventions by the parents. That is, the toddler is playing over there, and the Hispanic mothers that we were working with would come and swoop the child up and play with them or do whatever, or swoop the child up from the floor and go about doing whatever they needed to do. And that was associated with a positive or secure attachment. The same behavior of scooping up a kid and interrupting whatever they were doing among the white middle-class mothers was associated with insecure attachment. So what is it about the connection there between culture and attachment and the maternal behaviors that are associated are so important for us to keep in mind, particularly in today's conversation when we're talking about a primarily Latino population coming from Central America who have been detained and deported and have had all sorts of difficulties during their journey north. So I point that out because I think it's important to do that. The other is that I'm getting older and older, much older than most of you, and I'm distressed by the seeming use of the word or the concept of trauma so readily on everything, as if everything is a trauma, when in fact it might be just a stress. So nowadays it seems that stress and trauma are used interchangeably, and I might slip into that myself, by the way. But when we're doing clinical assessments and treatment, we really we must be clear about what each means, right? Traumatic experiences are always stressful, but not all stressful experiences are traumatic. So for instance, in childhood stress, the stress and stressors are really the things that life throws at us, right? That upset our balance the same way it does with children and adults. But as I say, stress is not always harmful. And we know that sometimes stress is good for us, both with response to the immediate crisis or situation, but also in the long term, we learn to deal with it better. And that stress could go from mild to severe. But we do know that cumulatively, stress can cause damage to the mind and the body, the brain and the body. And how well we respond and cope may be strengthened or weakened by the experience and the exposure to stress. I'm always mindful of the work of the Russian psychologist Lev Vygotsky, who talked about the zone of proximal development, and that's the kind of the microcosm of the family itself, where culture is really transferred between parent and child in micro interactions. And we do know, so that when I was talking before about swooping up the child or holding routinely associated in one group with insecure and in another group with secure, reveals the importance of us looking at that micro system or the zone of proximal development, as Vygotsky referred to it. Childhood trauma, of course, is a scary, dangerous, violent, or life-threatening event that can happen to a child before the age of 18. But we all know that a dangerous, scary, violent, or life-threatening event can happen to any of us, and it will stay with us for a lifetime. But it may not, and it be traumatizing for the immediate, time afterwards, or it can be lifelong in the case of traumas that we see in war and other specific incidents in our lives. The trauma may happen to someone else, but the child's, it traumatizes the child by the child seeing or hearing the other person being hurt or injured. So in the case of domestic violence, it traumatizes the child when they see someone else in the family being beaten or injured. And that causes the child to feel overwhelmed, upset, and even helpless as well. Now, ACEs, right? Adverse childhood experiences, we know about that. It really is the accumulation of stresses and trauma in childhood. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because when we talk about the children who have been through these incredible journeys north and what they've experienced, it is incredibly stressful when you begin to hear the stories and to speak to the children and to the families, and you realize what incredible hardship they have gone through and how there's been an accumulation of hardships from the time they were in their countries of origin to the moment that they are, and beyond the time that they are held by Immigration and Customs Enforcement in the United States. And as we know, ACEs can include any number of things: abuse, neglect, financial hardship, violence, parental separation, incarceration of household members, a whole panoply of things that cumulatively will cause harm, psychological and physical harm to us, because we know that adverse childhood experiences, when unremitting and untreated, can have lifelong effects on cardiovascular systems, cognition, social interactions, and things like that. So let's talk about the migrant children that I've been seeing since 2014, for the most part, when I was first involved in evaluating them in detention centers here in South Texas. Not just I, but the literature really talks about the pre-migration experience of the children, the migration or the in-transit experience, and then the post-migration experiences of stress and trauma. And I want to take that approach in order to explain some of the things that I've been hearing from children and families and how we might be able to assess them and treat them in our clinics. This is very common, the sort of scenes that we see or that children report seeing in many of the countries in Central America because of the violence. It really doesn't even include what's happening with respect to the impact of global warming and the droughts and rainfalls that are washing villages and the crops that they're planting, or the droughts that are causing a great deal of famine. We see here, what children witness and the pain and sorrow that they have. You can see the little girl both at the top, when if you could ever come close to the eyes, you could see the traumatized eyes, and the little girl at the bottom left who's covering her eyes because of what she has seen there. And so we do know that sort of stress and trauma carries a heavy burden when we talk about post-traumatic stress disorder, which we will in a minute. In fact, there it is. When we know that when witnessing death or a dead body or a serious injury, someone who either at the moment that they are being injured or killed or immediately afterward, that is a stressful, even a traumatic event. Long ago, and this still remains in my mind, as when I witnessed, I was on a bus in Manhattan, and I witnessed a young man be struck by a van. Literally, as I looked out the window, there the van hit this young man. Later on, I learned he was a student, a dental student at Columbia University. But I remember that while it was fleeting, I saw the moment in which he was killed. He died later. I read the papers, but he was killed at that moment, and that still remains a vivid image in my mind. And for days after, of course, I had many of the symptoms of post-traumatic stress, of sleeplessness, and the recurring vision of that young man being struck. So we do know that when people witness this sort of serious injury or the death of someone, or even a dead body shortly after death, that it adds a large part to the PTS burden that we may already have. It affects our memory, our sense of the helplessness, which is part of the etiology of PTSD. And of course, the memory formation, it becomes intrusive, vivid in recall, such as the incident that I experienced. And mine was one experience. I'm sure you've all had something similar, or of people who have. And imagine more of those. I saw one. That's the only time I've ever seen someone be killed. That was one. But the children and families that I have spoken to have seen much more than one person being seriously injured or killed, or they themselves were the victims of the physical attacks. Let me tell you a little bit about Danny. Danny was a 7-year-old boy I met. He was among the first kids I evaluated in Cohort Detention Center in Cohort City, Texas, where he and his mother and his brother were housed, were being detained after leaving, I think it was Honduras, leaving Honduras. So Danny was this irrepressible 7-year-old at the time. And so I asked him, draw pictures of what it was like in your town. And so he drew this picture. The gangs in his town were called the Rebos Locos, or at least that was the local term. I've never figured out what the Rebos Locos means, if it means anything, or and I look it up on Google, and I got some rock band from years ago. I don't know, but anyways, the gang members in his town were referred to as Rebos Locos. And I said, what makes them bad guys? And he points to the picture in the middle. They carry guns, and he says, and they smoke cigarettes. And then he went on to tell me how they set fire to houses, as you see at the bottom right, and the death of people that they had killed. They also set fire to other houses or invaded them, but they have cigarettes in their hands. One, let me see, I think one of them had a beer in his hand. Well, maybe not. These were recreated pictures of Danny's pictures. I didn't have permission from the family to use them, so I forged his artwork. So I'm an art forger on top of being a social worker and a psychologist. But look at the horrified son at the top, witnessing this. So this was the type of stress that Danny was experiencing day in and day out in his little town. Then one day that trauma came home, that stress and trauma. And here in this picture he drew for me was the day that his uncle was killed by some intruders, men who broke into the house and shot his uncle. Down at the bottom right here, you see mi papa y mi mama. The mom is distressed. I believe it's her brother who was killed. And here you see the Rebos Locos. Here's the one with the beer can. They shoot birds, but they had just shot his uncle. But the shooting occurred in the dining room or kitchen of their home. And when Danny heard of this, he ran to his uncle's house and he told me, and I saw my uncle's teeth. I couldn't recognize his face, but I saw his teeth coming out of the back of his head. So we're talking about, he didn't see the actual killing, but he witnessed the dead body of his uncle, a loved one. Over here at the top, of course, the grandparents, the abuelos, are really highly distressed. They all lived near one another on this side of a hill. And again, you see the son just horrified by what Danny had witnessed. Now, one of there's more to this story, at least with respect to what happened, is that shortly after this shooting, Danny was beaten by one of these rebos locos. And it was at that point that the family said, we have to flee. Unfortunately, the father, who was a single leg, look at the bottom right, single leg amputee, could not go get through the terrain. And so it was mother and two sons, Danny, his brother, and mom who left. And there's more details on this particular story at a TED talk that I did in 2019, and there's a hyperlink there for those of you who might want to follow it or watch it sometime. So then there's the in transit, the migrating through Mexico. So we see what happens, and Danny's story, by the way, is no different than many of those that I've heard, and probably many of those that you heard or will hear about. And the issue in this transit is that who do you trust? You know, there are coyotes who are leading you. You're encountering criminals and organized gangs. Like one of the mothers and child that I interviewed from my research told me about how other coyotes killed the coyote that was leading them, who they trusted and was treating them well, and killed him and helped them get to the U.S., but under duress and with other ransoms. They see violence and death. They're victimized themselves in prison. You know, there's all sorts of deprivation, intimidation, physical abuse, sexual assaults, all sorts of things. Again, things that you probably heard or will hear from your clients. But there's this constant danger. So we're talking about families that might have come across in a couple of weeks, and some who took sometimes 6 months because of financial situations or because the coyotes held them in some places until they had enough people to bring together to the border. And then the post-migration trauma and stress are when they are apprehended by the U.S. Customs and Border Protection at the border after they've gone through this, including near drownings in the Rio Grande or Rio Bravo, depending on how you look at it. And then they're put in these hieleras, which are cold. You see, they look like the high school locker rooms, but cold. Lights are kept on all day. Temperature is kept at about 50 something. There's only one toilet for them, and it's behind these walls. You see the half walls. Actually, the bottom right one, you can see the part of the toilet. So you're in there with about 30 people for about 48 to 72 hours. And this is how you're living with the same clothes you came across, no shower, not great food, and unknowing whether you're going to be sent back or whatnot, plus the threats from the guards and so on. In the research that we've done and that of others, McLaughlin and others, really what creates this detention trauma is the deprivation, such as those that I've mentioned before, which is the absence of developmentally expected, appropriate environmental inputs and complexities. And so when we saw children in detention, a lot of this was gone. They just simply didn't have any freedoms. They, like our kids, right, who can ride the bike up and down the street or walk with their friends to school in the morning in their backpacks and animated and ready for a school day. All of that is gone when you're in detention. There's your parents don't regulate you. It's the prison guards, and they are prisons, despite the fact that they're called family residential centers very quaintly. Then there's the threat, the constant threat, the threat of immediate or ongoing experience. The presence of that threat that makes the child feel vulnerable, both psychologically and physically. Guards are not necessarily nice people. There are good people, of course, as well. But the threat that you could be deported or your mom could be deported, you could be separated, creates a lot of that trauma. I bring up this case here of a 3-year-old boy. This is back in 2017, who was released. He had been locked up with his mother. This is in Berks County, Pennsylvania, for 2 years. So 2/3 of his life, his early life, were spent in prison. And his mom is quoted in the newspapers as saying he learned how to walk and talk there, meaning in the prison, in the detention center. But that's where he learned everything. And the picture there is his first time ever having a meal outside of prison, outside of the detention center. And it's a moving sort of story, and which is why I use it, because it tells you what damage this will have done to this child, having spent 2 years of his 3 tender years in prison. Now, detention disrupts family functioning, right? The moms and the dads, their own mental health is tested. Their functioning is really eroded in the context of the detention center. They cannot discipline their children. They're disempowered from anything like that. They don't say when kids eat, when they go to bed. Everything is regulated by the detention center. So the important family rituals and routines are eliminated, or at the very least reduced. Several families are held in one cell. So that means that if you're the parent of a child and you're accustomed to putting them to bed at 8 o'clock, but you're accustomed to also saying prayers or telling stories, bedtime stories, that's not necessarily possible, because there are other people milling around, other families in your cell, and they may not be observing the same patterns or the same rituals, or there may be arguments going on. So all of those things that are so important to families and the identities and the stuff that glues families, cements families together, are all changed. The parent-child dynamic is disrupted. Now the child sees mom is not in power anymore. I can do all sorts of things, and that can be acted out. And the parent's powerlessness is visible to the child. And while it frightens them, because their key protectors are weakened or inadequate, they can also disrupt the parental-child interaction. And then we know about the long-term effects of detention on children. We're learning more and more about immigration detention, but we do know that from the work primarily done in Australia and England, the fear of being returned from the home country, the sudden and upsetting memories, the nightmares and images of that threat, of the threats, the deprivation, the humiliation that they experience in detention. And it's been reported that there have been episodes of numbness, dissociative experiences post-detention. And we're seeing some of that. One of the children in our study was hallucinating a child who killed other children inside the detention center. This was reported after, because all our interviews were post-release. The child feels criminalized, helpless, and may begin to function almost as if they're prisoners, and their sense of safety, well-being is shattered. Of course, they have no sense of belonging. Now, when we talk about separation, we know that first we start with attachment, and then there's a separation. And of course, the distress comes anytime the parent and the toddler and the infant are separated. We see it all the time when parents go to work. Discomfort and anxiety when losing contact with the caregiver, or for adults, it's in reaction to the traumatic loss of a spouse or a partner, someone important. There's anxiety, of course, that comes with it. Experience the anxiety, the fear of separation from the attachment source. Now, this can be temporary, or it can be, it can stress us out for a while, or it can have long-term effects on children. And so I think it's important for us to talk about traumatic separations, the sudden, unexpected, inexplicable ruptures of the physical presence of parents, and that bond is disrupted. One of the chapters in the book I'm writing now is on what happened during the 2018 family separation practices under zero tolerance policy of the Trump administration. And we have children who experience these traumatic moments and separations rather, and were never the same, and because that bond was truly, truly ruptured. As clinicians, we can think about following a rupture in the attachment of that kind, whether what we see later is a reactive attachment disorder, where the child demonstrates some inhibited, emotional, withdrawn behavior towards the parent, in which there's limited positive affect, irritability, sadness, fearfulness. Again, we've been seeing kids who were separated and parents telling us, that it's not the same child I had before. He wouldn't let me out of his sight when we were first reunited. He doesn't like non-family members coming to the house, or he hides, or if I step away from the kitchen and he's at the kitchen table, he runs to find me, or she. So this is the sort of reaction that can happen in those traumatic separations, because the child has experienced some kind of neglect, deprivation, the sudden and repeated change of caregivers, or time in unusual settings after the disruption. So I'm about to show you a video that demonstrates one type of insecure attachment that we know from the literature, primarily through Mary Ainsworth's work on insecure attachment. One of them is the insecure avoidant attachment. This is after a separation, a child, upon reunion with the parent, expects to be rejected by the parent and avoids the parent, rather than doing what your securely attached child does, which is come to the parent, right? I love it. I have my granddaughters, and they run to me and they hug me because it's nice. They hadn't seen me in a while. But in this case, the insecure attachment, a child would be unsure and might not seek proximity to the parent because they don't know what the reaction will be. And so part of the avoidance of that connection is to avoid a possible conflict or a rejection. So I'm going to play this video in a moment. Some of you may have seen this. This is a difficult one to watch, and my wife refuses to come downstairs anytime I'm working in our study, and she hears me working with people on this video. But this is a little boy who was separated from his mother. Well, it was his mother and his father, this boy, and his infant sister. And when they arrived at the border, they were separated. The father was handed over his son. The mom kept the baby girl, and they were sent to separate detention centers. The little baby stayed with mother for the duration of the 3-month separation. The father and the son were separated. The father was held in detention, and the child was put into foster care and bounced around during those 3 months with different families. So, as I say, they were separated for 3 months. He's a mere toddler. He's under 3 years older. So I forget exactly how old he was. You can see this video. You can find it easily online. But you can see how he rejects and avoids his mom. Let me play it for you. Note how he is just, she wants to hug him. This is the reunion at the airport in Houston, and he throws his body away rather than coming in the way a securely attached child would. And she's asking her husband what's going on. Now, note that he goes towards his father, right? But in effect, he doesn't go towards his father. He goes between his father's feet or legs. Right. Before we move on, Dr. Prandoni, I'm open to a question or two, any comment on this particular video. And if the participants if they see, something that I didn't point out that oh, and by the way, look at how that father will not let go of his baby girl. He's been away from her for 3 months. But I'm open to some questions. I don't want to take too long. We can always come back to it during the Q&A, but any questions, comments on this?
Sure. I wonder if we can first have, reactions or comments on the video and the attachment concepts that we've been covering so far from folks. And then there's a couple of questions in the chat that I'll put to you, Dr. Zayas. So folks can feel free to unmute if you have any questions.
You might have to ask the question, Dr. Pandoni. I can't see anybody, or you.
Sounds good. Adam Goldhammer asks, is there a correlation between suicide and trauma experience in detention centers? And is there a correlation between childhood neglect and the parents that have trauma? So I guess a parent that has had trauma, does that lead to neglect in some cases? So maybe the first one.
Okay, the first one is, we don't yet know about children and adolescents who have been detained and whether there's suicide attempts or completed suicides. Some of the adolescents that I evaluated, and some of the adolescents in our study did talk about suicidal ideation while they were in detention, but not that we know. Now, however, we're still talking about a population that's just recently on our radar screen, and we won't know for years to come what that involves. What we do know of adults, primarily men, who have suicided in detention, in some cases because one was going to be deported and his family was going to remain here, and he suicided. The other one, which was one that I was involved in, and that was where the father and the son were together. The son was about 3 to 5 years old. It was hard to do an evaluation on a child that young, but his father was in a cell with him, and somehow the father went around the corner somewhere and hung himself. The child didn't see the father, but there are those incidents and many more that have been reported of the adults. Some women, I did evaluate one mom who had suicidal ideation. In my evaluation of her, we discovered that she had a suicidal behavior in her past. So that was not necessarily detention induced, but detention exacerbated, if you will. Hope that answers. Oh, and what was the other question about?
Whether the parent's experience of trauma leads to neglectful behaviors towards caregiving. With this population, I don't know. But if we talk about what we know clinically and in research with the general population, yes. When kids are abused or neglected, severely neglected, not just kind of minor neglect by parents, there is a history of suicides. In our study on the suicide attempts of young Latinas, we found that abuse and neglect was, and couldn't say a predictor because we didn't have a large enough sample, but there were high correlations between those who had experienced some abuse and neglect as younger and their likelihood to attempt suicide. Thank you, Dr. Zayas. I wonder if I can ask a quick question myself. I'm wondering if you have any data or no, because I'm getting to the solutions here, and I know you're going to talk about interventions shortly, but whether age is a predictor of recovery. So like, if kids experience these things young enough, does their brain plasticity allow them to react better to intervention and maybe repair these bonds? Or, how does that play out?
Wow, great question. And indeed, we have seen in the research and just even in the evaluations that I've been doing, because in 2014, I was invited for the first time to start doing evaluations on behalf of some class action lawsuits that we filed. And in fairness, we filed lawsuits against the Obama administration, the Trump administration, and more recently, the Biden administration. So we're equal opportunity filers of lawsuits on the matter of detention. But there is, let me say, in my research and in the clinical work that I'm doing, the teenagers or children kind of where their cognition is more highly developed understand what's going on. It's not good. It's still painful. They're cognizant of the experience. It still is stressful and traumatizing for them, but they're further along in their development, and so they can understand what it means. Not fully, but they can get a sense that this is a government, a government who's doing this to me. The little ones, like that little boy in the video, or this baby, will not know what it means. That why am I in detention? No amount of explaining can affect that. The problem is that yes, there's plasticity, right, of the neurobiological system, the brain, but that means we've got to intervene. So that little boy there, we needed to get him into intervention as soon as that family hit whatever small town or large town that they were going to. That this family was actually featured in I think it was 60 Minutes segment months later, and the mom said he's starting to reconnect with her, but he's still not the same. I don't know if they had any parent-child interaction, but we are going to talk about that in a few minutes. So I hope that answers your question, Dr. Bamboni.
Yes, thank you. So interesting. We have a quick question from Randy Garcia. He's wondering if there's similar ways that this plays out in separations due to deployments. And I don't know if you can speak to that from your
military
experience.
Deployments.
Yes, I believe so.
I don't think it's the same level of stress and trauma, because deployments are usually notified, in advance. Plus, your mom or your dad is an active duty military person, so it's a different sort of sequence. It's different, say, from a child whose parent dies, but has a terminal illness and dies over time. It's also different when there's a separation death, in effect, because of a car accident, where the child can mourn and grieve and go with the others and be able to see their parents. So I can't speak to the military, but I do think that because there's a period of time before that separation occurs, and there might be some processing, that it's less injurious. But that's just a speculation. For whoever asked that question, we have the Institute for Veteran and Military Family Wellness. My colleagues there could probably answer that question more intelligently.
Thank you, Dr. Zayas.
Okay, let me move on to the next, because I want to make sure we have time for more discussion. All right?
Sounds good.
Okay. Oops. Sorry. So now so that's one form. That's the insecure avoidant, the child avoids. The other that was identified, and there's the securely attached child, and then the insecure. There's also another one. It's called disorganized, but I don't have evidence of that yet. Although that little boy there could have some of the disorganized element of attachment. But in the insecure ambivalent attachment, now the child is uncertain of the parent's response on the reunion, but the reunion occurs. But the child is leery. In the case of the avoidant, the child really tries to avoid. And in the case of the ambivalent child, they'll display passive or angry resistant behavior that is a kind of approach avoidance sort of behavior. And when the parent responds, the child becomes ambivalent. So here's let me explain it differently. In this case, at one moment, the child may feel securely attached, and the parent only needs to say or do something that turns the child kind of towards ambivalent and not really loving or wanting to be near the parent. Something I know that in borderline personality disorders, we see that sort of anticipation of rejection or rejection or abandonment, and there may be some elements of that in this. So in this next slide, and we can discuss it afterwards as well, this is a boy who's already in the shelter with his mom, and it's apparently a shelter that's run by a nonprofit group, and it's a much longer video. Earlier in the video, you see the child interacting with his mom. Excuse me, water. You see the child interacting with his mom quite well, the way most kids, young kids would. But then there's a moment, and I don't, in the video, you don't know quite what it was that triggered the episode that we're about to see that led me to view this as insecure, ambivalent. And you'll see the angry, resistant behavior. I'm sorry, I didn't mention that they too had been separated. And then they were reunited, and now we're in the shelter.
Toda esta separación fue muy larga, mi hijo ya cambió mucho. Con tanto trauma. Ya no quiero ser tu hijo, ya no soy tu hijo.
This is a very vivid demonstration of what happens after separation. If you want, as I had to do for my book, just go back to all the news reports between July and late and December of 2018. The newspaper reports of children reunited are replete with examples of this type of thing. He doesn't recognize me, he avoids me, he's anxious, he doesn't like me, he says, I'm not your mom, you're not your dad. It's almost like I've got a different child, just everywhere. And so before we move on, any questions on this particular video or the application of the insecure ambivalent to this child?
So Jenny Lopez shared a comment. Jenny, do you want to speak it or do you want me to read it?
Thank you, Juan. Hi, Dr. Zayas. I'm Jenny Lopez from the Third Alliance. I'm the Immigrant Outreach Program Director here in Western North Carolina. And this is so hard to watch. Like working with immigrant families, like seeing these policies that are so inhumane. And that's why I think from the advocacy needs to come also from mental health professionals. We need to work also not at the micro level, but at the macro level. It's, for me, it makes me sad, it makes me angry. And to see this, like, it makes me, yeah, like, just, it's so concerning that these children are going through this. So thank you very much for advocating for these families. And I don't know if in the advocacy part, like if you just mentioned that you have you filed some lawsuits with other group, and how else mental health professionals can help.
Yeah. Ms. Lopez, I want to get to that because in February, President Biden signed an executive order that I hope will help us do exactly what you're talking about. So if you could wait a couple of more slides, but it's re-traumatizing. I had to, there was a time, my heroic sense of self, I was going to the detention center regularly, and I realized it was killing me. And I felt guilty because there were families still in there that needed my help. But I also needed to be with my family. I needed to go out and, play with my family and go on vacations. Otherwise, what good would I have been? So it is difficult. And even now, as I talk to you, I feel the tears welling in my eyes because it's painful. And I think we need to think, about self-care as clinicians. What are we going to do for ourselves when we go home and on weekends so that we don't carry this with us? Because the pain, the sorrow is powerful. We're going to see it shortly, and you'll see some of them, the Haitian families and children at the border these days. You're going to see it among the Afghani refugees that will come, that are already in our country, are coming. We're going to see it. We're going to see it, and it will be upon us clinicians to work with them. of course, I focus on this group, and that's the research I'm doing, and I'm bilingual, so it's easier for me to work with them. But you're absolutely right. So it is very painful.
Thank you.
Actually,
go ahead.
No, go ahead. You had another question, or do you want?
No. I was going to say we can move on if you want to make sure we
Okay.
get to those other points and then leave more Q&A in the end.
Very well. Well, all right. So I think, you've got this slide speaks for itself. All of that stress, the trauma really endangers children's developmental trajectory. We know that it's going to be that little boy will, I pray that they have gotten some parent-child interaction therapy, that the father's involved, that the little sister's engaged, that the child himself has a chance to have individual therapy, just everything we can to wrap around that family. And there's thousands more. There are thousands. In the research that I've been doing, trying for this book, trying to figure out exactly how many families were affected by this. We're talking in the thousands, perhaps in the tens of thousands, where there was detention and separation from as little as 24 or 48 hours to 3 months or even more. And those who were never reunified, children who's lost their parents, whose parents were deported and can't be found. So we do know that that's going to affect children. We talk about traumatic loss, right? Some of these children's traumatic losses are not just traumatic, but permanent, insofar as they're not going to ever be reunited with their parents because their parents died, deported, and can't be found, and so on. But we know that that's going to harm these children in terms of just their development, right? We're talking about the stress responses, the symptoms of numbness, depression, upsetting memories, fears. It's going to affect the development of their brains, the psychological, social, academic, all sorts of manner of deviations from a normal development. So to Ms. Lopez, this is the executive order that I was referring to that was signed in February by President Biden. And he established an interagency task force on the reunification of those families who have been through separation. It will likely include many of the families who were detained and weren't separated, but they're probably going to be included. So one of the things that executive order requires is that the US locate and reunify all separated families. And we're talking about if the parent was deported to Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, wherever, that we as a country will be going to that country to find that parent and bring them back. And the other is that this is going to be a nationwide effort to provide services and support to the children and their families, including trauma and mental health services. By the way, there was a federal judge who, during the Trump administration, who found that the Trump administration had violated all sorts of things, and that not only should they reunite these children, but they needed to provide mental health services. That fell off, and I never heard about that again. And I believe that President Biden's executive order of February 2nd was intended to put into effect, operationalize the judge's determination and finding. And I hope I'm involved now with the group that will be working on this national effort, and I'll probably be turning certainly to Dr. Brandoni and his group and others of you, because we're talking about families who are going to be dispersed across the country. We have 14 cities where they are mostly at, but many of them have also gone on to smaller towns and rural areas. So we've got that, and that's our hope. That means that with this executive order being implemented, not only will we be able to do much more of the macro advocacy, the lawsuits and things like that we've done, but for you to do local work to make sure that those families get the services, from A to Z, from soup to nuts, so that the damage can be contained. I don't think we're going to be able to reverse it. Some of the damage is permanent, but if we can contain it and provide some healing for these families and hopes of a future, that we could do that. I think, I don't know how many, this is my last slide, or there might be one more, but let me just see. Well, let's just go back. I'm gonna stop there and open it up for a conversation among us, because I wanted to get into clinical interventions and the variety of possibilities and questions like, how might you intervene in the case of the child with the avoidant reaction, the boy with the ambivalent reaction? How would you work with these parents? What community services would you identify for them? And any number of families, and not just these two, but and how do we get our own organizations to be more responsive and adapt to the needs of this population? Because it's not a matter of if they're coming to your communities, it's when they come to your communities and your services. So I'll stop there and I will unshare. If you need to reach me, that's my email there. But I'll stop sharing and let's get into it.
Thank you, Dr. Zayas. So yeah, I invite you all to jump in on the conversation if you have treated or worked with unaccompanied minors. I know we've come across quite a few at El Futuro. Being faced with these horrible stories and wanting to respond appropriately, but sometimes I know there's limitations in the kinds of resources that are available to us. So yeah, please feel free to jump in and just share any thoughts or experiences that you've had working with this population. And Dr. Zayas, I wonder.
Yeah, I'm muted. I was about to speak. And
Yeah.
if you don't ask questions, I'll keep talking. I enjoyed talking, and this is a topic of great passion to me. So you know what happens when you have a passionate person. It's nonstop. So please hold me back, or I'll keep going.
Well, Dr. Zayas, I wonder if you could provide kind of an overview of the interventions that are recommended, because I'm sure folks out there are doing good work that works on these issues, but they may not be fully confident that they're doing the right thing. Or does it require like an EVT plus a social work angle as well, or more community supports as well? Yeah, so Luke says, what is the soup to nuts approach according to the expertise that you have in working with this population?
Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. It's of course it's a loose term, but I'm talking about everything from when a family arrives, housing, right, employment, schooling, connection with churches, recreation leagues, social service agencies, mental health, everything that we can wrap our arms around and provide this family with the abundance of resources that we have in this country and in your communities. That's what I mean. I'm on the board of a shelter here, Casa Marianela, all that is all refugees and immigrants, mostly women with their children. And I mean, we work on employment, and we work on parent-child interaction. We teach young mothers from places like the Congo who don't understand. We lost an infant last summer because a young 18-year-old mom left the baby by the water in a small tub, with like 2 inches of water, that sort of thing, and the baby drowned. Though, we need to provide that level of service and instruction. So the psychoeducational part, right? Both of these moms that were seen in the videos, we would need to help them understand why little Henry in the second one, and why, I forgot what the child's first name was in the first one, Sammy they called him, why Sammy is the way he is. They don't have the degrees and the education that you do. Chances are they come from poverty and rural areas in the highlands of Guatemala or places like that. So they may not understand, but I am his mom, he loves me. Although that one mother said, mi hijo está traumado. She knows that her child is traumatized. She doesn't know all that means to you and me, and how that's affecting the brain and the child's neurobiology, and what she figures love will cure it, and it does, but not love alone. It needs love and therapy, right? Parent-child interaction therapies would be important. Play, child and parent play some level of exposure therapy. I'm meaning that you separate the child from the parent and be able to help that child understand that parents are okay. I had a case that this was a different sort of case. It was I was working with attorneys representing a father who was being deported, and the U.S. citizen daughters were young, and they had a separation because of his detention. And so I'm interviewing the parents, and I had the children out in the waiting area, and the little girl just couldn't. She had to knock on the door every 2 minutes. There was no way out of my office except through that one door, but she could not tolerate this. So that's the level of effect. So they were receiving services in their community in that case. But we're talking everything from, and then the individual child therapy to the parents' own therapy and their own stress, because the parents they had their own amount of accumulated stress. We had in the bus station at San Antonio, I met a mother. Actually, it was a 13-year-old girl with a cast on her leg, and I asked about the cast, and it was an awful. She was thrown off a truck by some bad guys, and the girl had suffered a compound fracture. Was carried by 3 angels, she called them, 3 men to a farmhouse where they put splints and things like that. But I asked her about her travel. She says, "Well, there was a time when we were on a bus, and all of the women were told to get off, and all of the women were raped, and all of the women but 2 were put back on the bus." She didn't say I was raped. She said all the women were raped. So she separates enough to tell a man, first of all, and I'm essentially a stranger, although they knew us there because we'd been, my students and I had been hanging around the bus depot a lot. But she was able to, that's how she could tell me that all the women were raped. So she's got her own stuff in addition to, the pain that her daughter went through, and the splint and the carrying with no painkillers until they got to the border, and the Customs and Border Protection people, she said, were wonderful. They took the girl to a hospital right away, and they had to do surgery and put in screws and whatever they do. And she had a nice looking cast on her leg at that point. But it was a 13-year-old girl, just the look in her eyes is of depression. And the little brother, 6 or 7 years old, he was busy playing. He didn't know, he was doing what a little boy would do, though he probably saw his sister's, broken leg at the time, except it may not emerge in his thoughts until, as we know, once there's a period of quiescence or that people settle in, that's when the old stuff boils up, because that functioning, that hyper functioning to keep things out of the way just to survive. Now you're surviving. Now you've got a bed and meals, and you go to school, and now all that stuff that you've been repressing starts coming up, or suppressing starts coming up.
Thank you, Dr. Zayas. I wonder if I can jump in with a question, because I'm just thinking, I haven't worked directly with an unaccompanied minor or someone who's experienced these things, but I'm thinking clinically, I'm always trying to think like, I wish there was a manualized treatment for this. There obviously isn't one. But I'm thinking, it's
well, there might be. Check out the what is it, the National Child Trauma Stress in UCLA. They just published something 2 months ago on work with unaccompanied minors. It's based on their other EBTs, right? But for this population, and so anyway, just put it out there, and it's worth looking for.
We'll try to find that and share it with folks that attended today. But I guess my question comes from that. So it seems like it's this repairing the attachment and these are bilateral, both for the parents and for the kids. There's also processing the trauma. And I'm just wondering, how do you make a call on what to do first? Do you do them simultaneously? I don't know is it a case-by-case thing? Is it age dependent?
First of all, it's a case-by-case thing, and I have to admit that I don't do treatment anymore. Long ago, I was a clinician. Right now, I do clinical evaluations to help families, get through the asylum hearings or to avoid deportation. So I'm not doing the therapies, but that's a question that comes up. I've been asked in court. Well, which of the traumas was worse? The one in their country, the one on their way here, or the one in detention? And you can't, those are layers that we're going to have to peel away. to figure stuff out. And when we do our qualitative interviews, we try to tell the child, which is hard with children, but tell me what happened when you were living in that town back then. Okay, and when did this happen along the way? Was it before the bus ride? Or do you remember after that bus ride and you told me you had a good dinner? So you're trying to get a sense of when the stuff happened. And even in detention, when things happen, and who was it? Was it a male guard, female guard? Was it at the cafeteria? You're trying to tease things out, at least in an evaluation. So you've asked a great question, and I'm limited as to what I can say and what I do think that we need to work on what's most salient at the moment, and that's the behavior that we see, whether it's the nightmares, the night terrors, the disturbed sleeping, the regressions to bedwetting. I mean, we had an 8-year-old girl who was now insisting on being breastfed in detention. It was just rare. And the other mothers, of course, were saying, "Oh, what are your child is being silly," and they were berating the mother, so she wasn't feeling very good because the other mothers were, and they were saying, "Your child, something's wrong with your child." It was indeed, but they were not as kindly or as therapeutic as we might be in telling a mom that your child is displaying a disturbance in, a regression in behavior. But they're not, that's not what happens in prison. You don't treat people, they don't treat each other very nicely. And these are all moms who, individually, they love their kids, they're really good people. But when you're housed together in congregate care and you're stressed out and your own mental health is at risk and being taxed, you're not always the nicest person.
No, makes perfect sense. I want to invite others to jump in the call. I don't want this to just be me and Dr. Zayas talking.
I have another question, Dr. Zayas. I have heard about the Resignation Syndrome in other countries like Sweden and other refugee camps, where kids have to wait for so long for asylums and all the immigration process, like 5 years, 4 years, and then they basically give up on life, like they are hopeless. And that I have heard is called the Resignation Syndrome. So I don't know if here, have you seen that in the detention centers?
No, I have not seen that. I've read about it, and the reports from Europe, mostly from England and some of the Scandinavian countries, of that. Most of those folks are from the Middle East. So we have to think about what the cultural and religious influences are. But I have not seen resignation syndrome among the children here. Not to say that it doesn't exist, it might exist. But culturally, it may not be something that the kids here they revert to, if you will. So I can't speak, but what we see is more like the kind of the Western things that we know about stress and trauma and dissociation and numbness and night terrors and bedwetting. Separation anxiety is incredible, and without intervention, it only gets worse, or it might look like it's getting better, but it might not get better by itself. But let me go back to Ms. Lopez's earlier question. Oh, I'm sorry, Krista, did you have a question, or were you just okay? We have the first lawsuit that I was part of, a class action lawsuit, was during the Obama administration. It was against his Secretary of Homeland Security, brought by ACLU, the University of Texas Immigration Law Clinic, several others, and it was litigated actually by those fancy corporate law firms. They are incredible. And just as an aside, we've had some of them do pro bono work for our clients, and these are men and women who, in a day do mergers and acquisition law and make millions of dollars in just one of those moments. And they told me that this was the most rewarding work they had ever done, was to represent these families in their asylum hearing. And one of them was so happy. I remember he took a picture of himself in his Tesla, probably, took a selfie with the little boy in the back. Just glowing that he was out of the detention center. So that's the sort of thing. But anyways, we filed lawsuit in the Southern District Court of California. And I want you to remember that my hero's name. Her name is Dolly G. She is a judge, Judge Dolly G. She will be forever my hero. She's the one that said, you've got to release the children in detention. And she still is holding the federal government's feet to the fire to release children who are imprisoned. And of course, you know, the subsequent Obama administration and Trump administration kept doing end arounds, but she was always holding them because it went against the Flores settlement, which happened back in the Clinton administration, that said that children may not be held in detention. They must be held, if you're going to have them, in the least restrictive environment. Remember that term from special ed and things like that? Well, that was the same principle applied. And so she and the lawyers invoked that old law, and the government had to, but they kept fighting. Now, at the end of his administration, Trump, actually in 2019, near the end, I beg your pardon, at the end of 2018, after he stopped the family separations, he was now saying, well, tell you what, we won't separate families, we'll keep them in detention indefinitely. So, you know, it was against always working around what the courts. So, I mean, I'm not the one that leads these lawsuits, those are attorneys, but, you know, it's a chance for me to do advocacy at the level that I can, which is, and I think I want you all to know this, your expertise as behavioral health providers is essential to attorneys. In this and many other cases in other areas, but when it comes to immigration, they need someone who can talk about the behavioral health, the mental health, the child development issues that impact on the family when the attorneys represent them in immigration or federal court. Anyways, I can go on, but that's an important role for us. Whether you're a social worker, psychologist, psychiatrist, a licensed professional counselor, we have roles to play, which is it might be individual family by family advocacy. In the class action lawsuit, it was more around categories of people. So by the time we went to our first, the one that went before Dolly G, Judge G, I had already interviewed 30 families in the span of several days. So, you know, I could now say, here's the pattern. I saw a question come up, but didn't read it. So anyway, so there's that kind of advocacy at the local and at the national level.
Thank you, Dr. Zayas. Yeah, there's a couple of, I guess, more clinical questions from Adam. Just wondering if you see differences in the trauma responses experienced by some of the other populations that we mentioned, the Middle Eastern populations, with the separations and reunifications, or are we finding that this is a phenomenon that works similarly across cultures?
Yeah, I understand the question. You have to forgive me. I don't know what's happening. I haven't been reading up on what's happened to, say, the refugees from Afghanistan. I don't know what's happening. However, what we do know is way back, Pauline Boss, who did the traumatic loss, from the days back of the lost boys of Sudan who were separated from the parents, that there was long-term effects on them as well. Depression, uncertainty, problems with substance abuse, alcohol mostly, kind of intermittent employment and things like that. So that's what I do know. And some of the literature, some of the leading research has been coming out of Australia and England, looking at what's happened to kids. But I'm afraid I can't answer that as well. But I would imagine there would be lots of that. I mean, in many ways, a loss, separation is a universal. That is, we all, not universal, not all of us are, but our responses to attachment and loss is universal. Whether one of those early slides you saw an African American mom with her baby and someone from South Asia and her baby, and then there's a painting by Picasso of the mom and baby. It's, that attachment is so important. I spent some time in the Dominican Republic among Haitians in the Dominican Republic, and the moms and their babies were no different, than moms anywhere else, with their infants.
Thank you, Dr. Zayas. I wonder if I can sneak in a quick one. Sorry, I'm just nerding out on this, but also it's just a really, important topic. So I'm wondering, you mentioned that adolescents who have more of a capacity to think about and understand what is going on have less impacts than younger kids. And so I'm thinking also of family separations and reunification and segmented migration. And some of the therapy that I've done with those families that reunify here in the United States, a lot of the work or the progress that I've seen is when the parents are able to talk to the kids and create a shared understanding of why this happened, why this decision to leave the kid back home was made. So I'm wondering do you feel like something similar like that might be at play with these separations or reunifications, with the tensions of the need to educate the parents, like you said, to have them validate and explain to the kids why this has happened?
Sure. And I think, you bring up a good point, and that is the families who had parents who came here and had to leave their 7-year-old child behind and now reunited when he or she is 13, and the child never understood, except that mommy and daddy, trying to survive. That may be different from what we're talking about, in that these separations occurred under the circumstances where government separated them, and they were separated, but in the same country, in the same land. So that while the separations were in large distances. We had moms in Los Angeles and children in Chicago, things like that. And those tended to be, 3 months to 6 months. So I don't think for an older child that's an easier amount of time to process, because of their abstract thinking, the conceptual thinking and their cognitive development. So I don't think we need to do that quite with that group. However, using those same principles with the younger child as they age seems to me just one logical way. And since we don't have an EBT for every one of these, we need to mix and match, right, from other therapies that we know have worked. So the population you're referring to, how much of that can we use for children who were separated for 3 months, especially little Henry and Sammy, who were very young, will require a different approach than the 13, 14, 16-year-old boy who was separated from his family for a period of time. So I think we will need to make those judgments along the lines of the child's developmental needs.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zayas. Any quick final questions before we wrap up? No, we're running out of time. Okay, well, in that case, I'm going to ask everyone, if you feel comfortable, to turn your video on, turn your mute button off, and give a big round of applause. And join me in thanking Dr. Zayas for bringing this amazing presentation and just such a powerful presentation to us.
Thank you very much. Like I said before, when you ask someone who's passionate about something to talk, you can't stop them. And I hope I gave you an opportunity to ask your questions and at least helping in the work that you're doing. So I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you so much.
No, thank you, Dr. Zayas. So I'm just going to wrap this up real quick. So just a reminder that you can apply for our learning cohort. Again, you can go to our website or on our network. Just a note, this is going to be our regular time moving forward, although that does not apply to November and December because of the holidays. But typically they will be on the 4th Friday of each month, but our new time for the webinars will be 12 to 1:30. So hopefully this is a more accessible time. Sometimes people can take an extended lunch break and attend these sessions. Our next webinar, we have one of our presenters here on the call, Jenny and Jenny Lopez and Jose Perez from the 30th Judicial Alliance will be talking about some of the topics that came up today in terms of integrating advocacy and mental health practice for victims of crime. So please join us for that one on October 22nd. Again, 12 to 1:30 is the new time. You can join us on our network. We have over 1,000 people that work with the Latinx community in North Carolina in this network. So come join us and learn with us and share and support one another in doing this, as Dr. Zayas proved, very difficult work that we all do week in, week out. So thank you all so much for coming. Thank you again, Dr. Zayas, for lending us your time and sharing your expertise. This has been just such a treat. But yeah, thank you all so much, and we'll see you at the next one. Take care, everyone.